The smell of burning biscuits filled the cramped kitchen of the boarding house in Ely, Nevada, and Adelaide Armstrong knew what was coming before she even heard the heavy footsteps behind her. It was September 1883, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dust-covered windows as she frantically tried to scrape the blackened bottoms off the batch she had just pulled from the wood stove. Her hands trembled as she worked, knowing that her employer, Mrs. Hutchinson, had specifically warned her this morning that one more mistake would result in consequences. The older woman had been growing increasingly volatile over the past weeks, ever since Adelaide had arrived in town desperately seeking work after her father's death, left her with nothing but debts and a tattered dress. "What is that smell?" The shrill voice cut through the kitchen like a knife, and Adelaide spun around to face the red-faced woman who owned the boarding house. Mrs. Hutchinson was a large woman with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent scowl. Her beady eyes took in the scene before her, the burned biscuits, the flour dusted across the counter, and Adelaide's guilty expression. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Hutchinson. The stove was running hotter than usual, and I did not notice until it was too late. I can make another batch right away, and I will stay late to make up for the wasted flour and lard." Adelaide's words tumbled out quickly, hoping to appease the woman's anger before it erupted fully. But Mrs. Hutchinson was already moving forward, her face twisted with rage. "You worthless girl! Do you have any idea how much those ingredients cost? Do you think I run a charity here?" Before Adelaide could respond, the woman's hand shot out and struck her across the face with such force that Adelaide stumbled backward against the counter, her cheek burning from the impact. "Please, I did not mean to. I will do better, I promise." Adelaide raised her hands defensively, but Mrs. Hutchinson grabbed a wooden spoon from the counter and brought it down hard across Adelaide's shoulders. "You have been nothing but trouble since you arrived. Clumsy, slow, and now you are burning my supplies." Another strike landed on Adelaide's arms as she tried to shield herself. Tears streamed down her face, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. She could not afford to lose this position. She had nowhere else to go, no family to turn to, and the little money she earned here was barely enough to keep her fed. The beating continued for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a minute or two, when Mrs. Hutchinson finally stopped. Breathing heavily from the exertion, Adelaide was crouched on the floor, her arms wrapped around herself protectively. "Get up and clean this mess, and you will work without supper tonight to pay for what you wasted." Adelaide nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. As Mrs. Hutchinson stormed out of the kitchen, Adelaide slowly pulled herself to her feet, wincing at the pain in her shoulders and back. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and took a shaky breath. She had to keep going. There was no other choice. She was sweeping up the flour she had spilled during the confrontation when she heard the front door of the boarding house open and the sound of boots on the wooden floor. Mrs. Hutchinson's voice drifted back to the kitchen, suddenly sweet as honey. "Welcome, gentlemen. We have rooms available, and supper will be served in an hour." Adelaide quickly straightened her appearance as best she could, smoothing down her dress and tucking stray strands of dark hair back into her bun. Her left cheek was still throbbing, and she knew it must be red, but there was nothing to be done about that. She hurried to prepare a fresh batch of biscuits, this time watching the stove like a hawk. An hour later, she was carrying plates of food out to the dining room where several of the boarding house guests sat around the long table. Most were miners who worked at the copper mines outside of town, rough men who kept to themselves and rarely spoke to her beyond grunting their thanks. But today there were two new faces at the table. One was a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of the Nevada sky just before sunset, a deep blue-gray that seemed to see everything. He wore typical cowboy attire, dusty from travel, with a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. The other man was shorter and stockier, with a thick mustache and an easy smile. Both men had the look of ranch hands, likely passing through town on their way to somewhere else. Adelaide kept her eyes down as she served the food, not wanting to draw attention to herself. But as she placed a plate in front of the tall cowboy, she accidentally knocked over his water glass. The water spread across the table, and she gasped in horror. "I am so sorry." She grabbed a cloth from her apron and quickly began mopping up the water, her heart racing. Not another mistake. She could not handle another beating today. "Easy there, miss. It is just water, no harm done." The cowboy's voice was deep and warm, with a gentle quality that made her glance up at him in surprise. His eyes were kind as they met hers, and she saw him take in her reddened cheek and the way she was holding herself stiffly to avoid aggravating her bruised shoulders. "Adelaide, what are you doing?" Mrs. Hutchinson's voice snapped from the doorway, and Adelaide flinched involuntarily. "It was my fault, madam," the cowboy said smoothly, drawing Mrs. Hutchinson's attention away from Adelaide. "I moved my arm and knocked the glass over, clumsy of me after a long day of riding." Mrs. Hutchinson's expression shifted immediately, her anger replaced by simpering concern. "Oh, of course, Mr. Pearson, these things happen. Adelaide, fetch Mr. Pearson a fresh glass immediately." Adelaide nodded and hurried back to the kitchen, grateful for the cowboy's intervention, but confused by it. In her experience, men rarely spoke up to defend serving girls. She refilled the glass and brought it back out, setting it down carefully beside his plate. "Thank you, miss," he said quietly, and when his eyes met hers again, she saw something there that made her breath catch. Concern. Real, genuine concern for a stranger. She nodded and retreated back to the kitchen, her mind whirling. Throughout the rest of the meal service, she found her gaze drifting back to him. His name was Quincy Pearson. She had heard Mrs. Hutchinson use it. He and his companion, another ranch hand named Tom, were traveling from a ranch in California to Montana, where Quincy had inherited a small piece of land from a distant uncle. They were stopping in Ely for a few days to rest their horses and resupply before continuing north. After supper was finished and the dishes were washed, Adelaide finally had a moment to herself. She slipped out the back door of the boarding house and sat on the steps looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The desert air had cooled considerably, and she wrapped her arms around herself, wincing at the soreness in her shoulders. "Those are some beautiful stars." Adelaide jumped at the voice and turned to see Quincy Pearson standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands. "I am sorry. I did not mean to startle you," he said. "It is all right. I should get back inside soon anyway. Mrs. Hutchinson does not like us lingering." She started to stand, but he held up a hand. "Wait, please. I wanted to make sure you were all right. That mark on your face and the way you're moving, it looks like someone hurt you." His voice was gentle but direct, and Adelaide felt her defenses rising. "I am fine. I just had a small accident in the kitchen earlier." The lie came easily. She had learned long ago that telling the truth about such things only made situations worse. Quincy was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down on the step below hers, keeping a respectful distance. "My mother used to say the same thing when my father would come home drunk and angry. 'Just a small accident,' she would tell the neighbors. It took her dying for me to realize that staying quiet about such things does not protect anyone." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his words. "I am sorry about your mother." "Thank you. She has been gone 10 years now. I was 18 when it happened, and I left home the same day to make my own way. Best decision I ever made." He turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his eyes were earnest. "I know we just met, and you have no reason to trust me, but if you need help, I want you to know that I am willing to offer it." "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." Adelaide's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because someone should have helped my mother, and no one did. And because looking at you reminds me that there are still people in this world who need defending." He stood up and placed his hat back on his head. "I will be in town for a few more days. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." He walked away, leaving Adelaide sitting alone in the gathering darkness. His words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in months, she felt a small flicker of hope kindle in her chest. The next morning, Adelaide woke before dawn as usual and began preparing breakfast for the boarding house guests. Her body ached from the previous day's beating, but she pushed through the pain. She had survived worse. The kitchen was her domain in these early hours, and she found solace in the familiar routine of measuring flour, cracking eggs, and slicing bacon. She was extra careful with the biscuits this morning, checking the oven temperature twice and setting a timer using the old pocket watch Mrs. Hutchinson kept in the kitchen. The biscuits came out perfect, golden brown on top with no hint of burning. Adelaide felt a small sense of triumph as she arranged them in a basket. When she carried the food out to the dining room, Quincy was already seated at the table, talking quietly with Tom. He looked up as she entered, and a smile crossed his face when he saw her. It was not a flirtatious smile, or one that made her uncomfortable. It was simply warm and friendly, and it made something inside her chest tighten. "Good morning, miss," he said, as she set a plate in front of him. "Good morning, Mr. Pearson." She tried to keep her voice neutral and professional, but she could not help noticing the way his hair was still damp from washing, or how his shirt brought out the blue in his eyes. "Please call me Quincy. Mr. Pearson makes me sound like my grandfather." His smile widened, and she found herself smiling back despite her intention to remain distant. "Then you may call me Adelaide if you wish." "Adelaide. That is a beautiful name. Suits you." He took a bite of his biscuit and made an appreciative sound. "These are excellent. You are a fine cook." "Thank you." She felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment. Mrs. Hutchinson never praised her work, only criticized her mistakes. The morning passed without incident, and Adelaide began to relax slightly. Perhaps yesterday had been an aberration. Perhaps if she just kept being perfect, Mrs. Hutchinson would leave her alone. But her hopes were dashed when she was scrubbing the floors in the hallway and overheard Mrs. Hutchinson talking to one of the regular boarders. "I do not know why I keep that girl on. She is more trouble than she is worth, clumsy, careless, and she eats nearly as much as she earns." The woman's voice was filled with disdain, and Adelaide felt her chest tighten. She knew she ate very little, often going to bed hungry because Mrs. Hutchinson claimed she could not spare the extra food. "Why do you not just let her go then?" the boarder asked. "Well, more, because no one else will work for what I pay her. She has nowhere else to go, the poor thing. Her father drank himself to death and left her penniless. She should be grateful I took her in at all." There was a smugness in Mrs. Hutchinson's voice that made Adelaide's hands clench around the scrub brush. She finished the floors in silence, her mind churning. Mrs. Hutchinson was right about one thing. Adelaide had nowhere else to go. But was a roof over her head worth the constant abuse and humiliation? Her father had been a drunk, it was true, but he had never raised a hand to her. His vice had been the bottle, which had eventually killed him, leaving Adelaide alone in the world at 19 years old. That afternoon, Mrs. Hutchinson sent Adelaide to the general store to purchase more flour and sugar. Adelaide welcomed the excuse to leave the boarding house, even if only for a short while. The main street of Ely was busy with afternoon activity, miners heading to or from their shifts, ranch hands picking up supplies, and townspeople going about their business. The town had grown rapidly in recent years due to the mining boom, and there was an energy to it that Adelaide usually found exciting. But today she barely noticed her surroundings as she walked. She was leaving the general store, her arms laden with packages, when she collided with someone coming through the door. The packages tumbled from her arms, and flour spilled across the wooden walkway in a white cloud. "Oh no." Adelaide dropped to her knees, trying desperately to salvage what she could, but it was hopeless. The flour bag had torn, and most of the contents were now coating the ground. Tears sprang to her eyes as she realized what this meant. Another waste, another beating. "Adelaide, hold on, let me help you." Quincy's voice broke through her panic, and she looked up to see him kneeling beside her, his hands already working to gather the undamaged packages. "Tom, go buy another bag of flour and put it on my account." "No, you cannot do that. I cannot accept that." Adelaide shook her head frantically. It was my fault for not watching where I was going. It was my fault for coming through the door without looking. Please let me replace it. It is the least I can do. His eyes were earnest, and Adelaide felt her resistance crumbling. Mrs. Hutchinson will ask questions if I come back with a new bag that I did not pay for. Her voice was small, defeated. Then tell her you found a better price at a different store. Or tell her the truth, that a clumsy cowboy knocked into you and replaced what was lost. Quincy stood and offered her his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Adelaide took it and let him pull her to her feet. Tom returned a few minutes later with a new bag of flour, and Quincy helped Adelaide gather all the packages. Let me walk you back to the boarding house. Those look heavy. You do not have to do that. But even as she said it, Adelaide hoped he would insist. She did not want him to leave yet. I know I do not have to. I want to. He took the heaviest packages from her arms, leaving her with only the lighter items to carry. They walked back to the boarding house in companionable silence at first. The afternoon sun was warm on Adelaide's face, and for a moment she could almost forget the troubles waiting for her back at Mrs. Hutchinson's establishment. Can I ask you something? Quincy's voice broke the silence, and Adelaide glanced over at him. Of course. Why do you stay with Mrs. Hutchinson? It is clear she treats you poorly, and I can see that you are miserable there. His question was blunt, but not unkind. Adelaide was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. Because I have nowhere else to go, no family, no money, and no prospects. At least at the boarding house, I have a bed and food, even if it is not much of either. There are other jobs in town, surely, the saloon, the hotel, maybe one of the ranch families needs household help. Quincy shifted the packages in his arms as they walked. The saloon girls are expected to do more than just serve drinks, from what I understand, and the hotel already has a full staff. As for the ranches, most of them are far outside of town, and I have no way to get there or any connections to help me find such a position. Adelaide sighed. I know my situation is not ideal, but it is all I have right now. They had reached the boarding house, and Quincy set the packages down on the porch. I understand. But Adelaide, I want you to know something. You deserve better than this. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness, not beaten for small mistakes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. I am staying at the boarding house for 2 more days, and then Tom and I are heading north. But before I go, I would like to talk to you more. If you are willing, meet me tonight after supper. There is a spot just behind the old church where we could talk privately. Adelaide took the paper, which had the meeting location written on it in neat handwriting. I do not know if I can get away. Mrs. Hutchinson watches me closely. Just try, please. His eyes were pleading, and Adelaide found herself nodding. I will try. That evening, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, Adelaide told Mrs. Hutchinson that she needed to visit the outhouse. The older woman waved her away dismissively, already settling into her chair with a glass of whiskey. Adelaide slipped out the back door and hurried through the darkening streets toward the old church at the edge of town. The church had been built in the early days of Ely, but had been replaced by a larger, newer building a few years ago. Now it stood empty, a reminder of simpler times. Adelaide found Quincy waiting behind it, leaning against the weathered wooden wall. He straightened when he saw her, a smile crossing his face. You came. I was not sure you would be able to get away. He gestured to a fallen log nearby, and they both sat down. I do not have much time. Mrs. Hutchinson will notice if I'm gone too long. Adelaide smoothed her skirt nervously. Then I will get straight to the point. Tom and I have been talking, and we have an idea. We are heading to Montana, to a piece of land I inherited. It is not much, just a small ranch, but it has a house and enough land to run some cattle. I am going to need help getting it established, and Tom has agreed to stay on as a ranch hand. We could use someone to help with the cooking and household tasks. He paused, meeting her eyes. I would like to offer you that position. Adelaide stared at him, certain she had misheard. You want me to come to Montana with you? To work on your ranch? Yes, I would pay you fair wages, provide room and board, and I can promise you that no one would ever lay a hand on you in anger. You would be safe there, Adelaide, and free to leave any time you wished if you were not happy with the arrangement. Quincy's voice was steady and sincere. But you do not even know me. How do you know I would not steal from you or cause problems? Adelaide could hardly believe what she was hearing. I am a pretty good judge of character, and my gut tells me you are a good person who has had a run of bad luck. Besides, Tom will be there too, so it is not like you would be alone with a strange man. Everything would be proper and respectable. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I know this is sudden, and I do not expect an answer right now, but think about it. We leave the day after tomorrow at dawn. If you want to come with us, meet us at the stable at sunrise. Adelaide's mind was reeling. Leave Ely? Travel to Montana with two men she barely knew? It was crazy, impulsive, and potentially dangerous. But as she thought about returning to Mrs. Hutchinson's boarding house, to the constant fear and abuse, the decision suddenly did not seem crazy at all. I will think about it, she said quietly. That is all I ask. Quincy stood and offered her his hand again, helping her to her feet. Thank you for meeting me tonight. And Adelaide, whatever you decide, I hope you find happiness. You deserve it. Adelaide hurried back to the boarding house, her heart pounding. She slipped in through the back door and found Mrs. Hutchinson dozing in her chair, the whiskey glass empty beside her. Adelaide crept up to her small room in the attic and lay on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Could she really do this? Leave everything she knew, even if that everything was not much? The thought terrified her, but it also thrilled her. For the first time in a year, she felt like she had a choice, a chance to change her circumstances rather than just endure them. She thought about Quincy's kind eyes and gentle voice, the way he had stood up for her, helped her, offered her a way out without asking for anything inappropriate in return. She barely knew him, but her instincts told her he was a good man. And sometimes, instincts were all you had to go on. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Adelaide had made her decision. She owned very little, just a few dresses and personal items that fit into a single small bag. She went through her morning routine as normal, preparing breakfast and serving the guests. When she set Quincy's plate in front of him, she met his eyes and gave him the smallest of nods. His face broke into a wide smile, and he nodded back. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Adelaide worked mechanically, her mind focused on the plan. She would leave everything behind tonight. She felt a pang of guilt at not giving Mrs. Hutchinson notice, but she knew the woman would never let her leave willingly. Mrs. Hutchinson had made it clear that Adelaide was trapped there, at her mercy. That evening, as Mrs. Hutchinson was settling in with her nightly whiskey, Adelaide made her move. She had already hidden her bag in the outhouse earlier in the day. She told Mrs. Hutchinson she was going to bed early and went up to her room, then waited for the sounds of the house to quiet. When she was certain everyone was asleep, she crept down the stairs, retrieved her bag, and slipped out into the night. The walk to the stable seemed to take forever. Every sound made her jump, certain that Mrs. Hutchinson had discovered her absence and was coming after her. But she made it without incident and found the stable door unlocked. Inside, in the dim light of a single lantern, Quincy and Tom were preparing their horses. Adelaide! Quincy's face lit up when he saw her. You came? I came. She set her bag down and wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly nervous about what she had done. You are making the right choice, Tom said kindly. He was a jovial man with laugh lines around his eyes, and Adelaide felt herself relax slightly in his presence. Quincy is a good man, and Montana is beautiful country. You will like it there. They left Ely just as the sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky pink and gold. Adelaide sat on the horse Quincy had purchased for her, a gentle mare named Daisy. She had not ridden much, but Daisy seemed patient with her inexperience. As they rode out of town, Adelaide looked back once at the boarding house in the distance. She felt no sadness at leaving it behind, only relief and a bubbling sense of anticipation for what lay ahead. The journey to Montana took nearly 2 weeks. They traveled through rugged terrain, across deserts and mountain passes, camping under the stars each night. Adelaide had never spent so much time outdoors, and she found herself enchanted by the vast beauty of the West. The endless sky, the dramatic landscapes, the way the light changed throughout the day, painting everything in different shades and shadows. Quincy was a patient teacher, showing her how to properly care for Daisy, how to make coffee over a campfire, and how to read the weather by watching the clouds. Tom kept them entertained with stories from his years of ranch work, and the three of them fell into an easy camaraderie that Adelaide had never experienced before. But it was Quincy who occupied most of Adelaide's thoughts. She found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way he moved with confident grace, how he was always the first to help when something needed doing, and how he treated her with unfailing respect and kindness. Sometimes she would catch him watching her too, and when their eyes met, she felt a jolt of something she could not quite name run through her. One evening, about a week into their journey, they made camp near a creek. Tom volunteered to catch some fish for supper, leaving Quincy and Adelaide alone to set up the camp. Adelaide was struggling with her tent, unable to get the poles to stay in place when Quincy came over to help. "Here, let me show you a trick." He positioned the poles differently and secured them with a few quick movements. "See? It is all about the angle." "Thank you. I'm not very good at this yet." Adelaide felt embarrassed by her incompetence, but Quincy just smiled. "You are learning fast. A week ago, you had never even put up a tent, and now you are almost doing it on your own." He stood beside her, and Adelaide was acutely aware of how close he was. "You know, I am glad you decided to come with us." "You are?" She looked up at him, and in the golden light of the setting sun, his eyes seemed to glow. "Very glad. This trip would have been much duller without your company." He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair that had come loose from her bun behind her ear. The gesture was so tender that Adelaide's breath caught. "And I like getting to know you. You are stronger than you think, Adelaide." "I do not feel very strong most of the time." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Strength is not about never being afraid or never getting hurt. It is about getting back up and keeping going, even when things are hard. And you have been doing that. You left a bad situation and took a chance on something unknown. That takes real courage." His hand lingered near her face, and Adelaide felt her heart racing. "Quincy, She did not know what she wanted to say, but the moment was broken by Tom's cheerful voice calling out that he had caught enough fish for all of them. That night, as Adelaide lay in her tent listening to the sounds of the creek and the crackling of the dying fire, she admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny. She was falling in love with Quincy Pearson. It was foolish, perhaps, to develop feelings for a man she had only known for a short time, but the heart rarely listened to logic, and Adelaide's heart was telling her that Quincy was someone special, someone worth taking a risk on. They crossed into Montana on a bright, clear morning. The landscape was different here, greener and more lush than the Nevada desert they had left behind. Rolling hills covered in grass stretched out before them, and in the distance mountains rose up against the sky like ancient sentinels. "We are almost there," Quincy announced, his excitement evident. "The ranch is about a day's ride from here." They reached the property late the next afternoon. It was modest, as Quincy had warned, but Adelaide thought it was beautiful. A small wooden house stood in a clearing, with a barn and a few outbuildings nearby. A stream ran along the edge of the property, and the land was perfect for grazing. The house needed work. Adelaide could see that even from a distance, but it had good bones, and with some effort it could be made into a real home. "What do you think?" Quincy asked Adelaide as they dismounted. "I think it is wonderful." And she meant it. This place had potential. It felt like a fresh start, a place where she could finally build a life free from fear and abuse. They spent the next several weeks settling in and making repairs. Tom set to work fixing the barn and corrals while Quincy focused on the house. Adelaide took charge of the interior, cleaning years of dust and neglect, patching holes, and making curtains from fabric they had purchased in the last town they had passed through. It was hard work, but Adelaide threw herself into it with enthusiasm. For the first time in her life, she was working towards something of her own. even if technically the ranch belonged to Quincy. He made it clear that she was a full member of their little household, that her input and ideas were valued. One morning, Adelaide was in the kitchen attempting to make biscuits in the cantankerous old stove. She had been fighting with it all morning, unable to get the temperature right. The first batch had come out pale and underdone. She adjusted the fire and tried again, but this time she overcompensated. When she pulled the pan out, her heart sank. The bottoms of the biscuits were badly burned, charred black. "No, no, no," she muttered, using a knife to scrape at the bottoms. Her hands started to shake as memories of Mrs. Hutchinson's fury flooded back. The slap across her face, the wooden spoon striking her shoulders, the cruel words. She felt tears prick her eyes as panic rose in her chest. "Something smells interesting in here." Quincy's voice made her jump, and she spun around to see him standing in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes took in the burned biscuits and her distressed expression. "I burned them. I am so sorry, Quincy. I was trying to get the temperature right, and I misjudged it. I will make another batch right away, and I will pay you back for the wasted flour and lard." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, and she could not stop the tears from spilling down her cheeks. Quincy crossed the room in 3 long strides and gently took the pan from her trembling hands, setting it on the counter. Hey, it is all right. They are just biscuits, Adelaide. But I wasted the supplies, and you worked so hard to earn the money to buy them." She could not seem to stop the tears now that they had started. "Adelaide, look at me." Quincy's voice was firm but kind, and she forced herself to meet his eyes. "You did not waste anything. You are learning to work with a new stove, and that takes time. I am not angry. I would never hurt you for making a mistake." He reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Do you understand? You are safe here. You never have to be afraid of being hurt again." Adelaide nodded, trying to compose herself. She felt foolish for her overreaction, but the fear had been so immediate and overwhelming. Quincy picked up one of the burned biscuits and examined it. Then, to Adelaide's shock, he scraped off the blackest part and took a bite of what remained. "You know what? These are actually not bad. I like them crispy anyway." He took another bite and gave her a lopsided grin. "Adds character." Adelaide let out a watery laugh despite herself. "You do not have to eat that. I know they are terrible." "They are not terrible. They are crispy and have a nice smoky flavor to them." He finished the biscuit and reached for another. "Besides, I have eaten much worse on cattle drives. One time the cook fell asleep and burned the beans so badly that they were more charcoal than beans. We ate them anyway because we were too hungry to care." Tom came in from the barn, drawn by the smell. "What did you burn?" "Adelaide made us crispy biscuits," Quincy said before Adelaide could respond. "Try one. They are good." Tom scraped off the burnt bottom and took a bite. "Not bad at all. Different, but good. Reminds me of the crackers my grandmother used to make." Adelaide watched in amazement as both men helped themselves to the burned biscuits, eating them without complaint, and even complimenting the flavor. She had expected anger, punishment, harsh words at minimum. Instead, she got kindness and encouragement. Something inside her chest loosened, a knot of tension she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten it was there. "Thank you," she said softly. "Both of you." "Nothing to thank us for," Quincy said. "But maybe next time let us know if you need help figuring out the stove. That old thing can be tricky." As the weeks turned into months, Adelaide settled into life on the ranch. She learned to manage the temperamental stove, mastering the art of reading its moods and adjusting the fire accordingly. Her biscuits became a source of pride, always golden brown and fluffy. She also took over the garden, coaxing vegetables from the Montana soil, and began preserving food for the coming winter. Quincy and Tom worked from dawn to dusk building up the ranch. They purchased a small herd of cattle from a neighboring rancher and began the hard work of establishing a viable operation. Adelaide watched Quincy transform from a travel-weary cowboy into a confident rancher. He was a natural leader, fair but firm, and the cattle thrived under his care. But it was the quiet moments that Adelaide treasured most. Evenings when the work was done and the three of them would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Sunday afternoons when they would ride out to explore the property and Quincy would point out landmarks and tell her stories about the land. The mornings when she would wake early and find Quincy already in the kitchen, starting the coffee, and they would talk softly while the rest of the world still slept. Adelaide's feelings for Quincy deepened with each passing day. She loved the way he laughed, a full-bodied sound that came from deep in his chest. She loved how he was patient with the animals, how he never lost his temper even when things went wrong. She loved the little things he did to make her life easier, like splitting extra firewood so she would not have to struggle with it, or fixing the pump so the water would flow more easily. But she kept her feelings to herself, uncertain if he felt the same way. Yes, he was kind to her, but he was kind to everyone. Yes, he sometimes looked at her in a way that made her heart race, but perhaps she was reading too much into it. She was an employee, after all, and he was her employer. She did not want to jeopardize the best situation she had ever had by revealing feelings that might not be reciprocated. Winter came to Montana with a vengeance. The first snow fell in late October, and by November the world was blanketed in white. Adelaide had never experienced a winter like this. In Nevada, winters had been cold but manageable. Here, the cold was bone deep, and the snow piled up in drifts taller than she was. They spent most of the winter months confined to the house and barn, venturing out only when necessary to tend to the animals. Tom proved to be an excellent storyteller, and many evenings were spent gathered around the fireplace listening to his tales of adventure and mischief. But Adelaide was most aware of Quincy's presence, of the way the firelight played across his features, of how his shoulder sometimes brushed against hers when they sat close to stay warm. One particularly brutal night in January, a blizzard struck with such force that visibility dropped to nothing. The wind howled around the house, and snow pelted the windows like thrown sand. Adelaide lay in her bed, bundled under every blanket she owned, listening to the storm rage outside. She heard footsteps in the hall and then a soft knock on her door. "Adelaide, are you awake?" Quincy's voice was muffled through the wood. "Yes, come in." She sat up, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. Quincy entered, carrying a lantern and an extra quilt. "I wanted to make sure you were warm enough. This storm is worse than I expected, and your room gets the brunt of the north wind. I am managing, but thank you for checking." She watched as he draped the additional quilt over her bed. He hesitated at the door as if wanting to say something more. Finally, he spoke. "Adelaide, can I tell you something?" "Of course." Her heart began to beat faster. "I have been thinking a lot lately about how different my life is now compared to a year ago, and I realize that the biggest difference, the best difference, is you." He set the lantern down and moved closer, sitting on the edge of her bed. "When I first saw you in that boarding house, with your bruised face and scared eyes, something inside me knew that you were important. I told myself I just wanted to help someone in need, the way I wished someone had helped my mother. But it was more than that." Adelaide could barely breathe. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that somewhere along the way, helping you stop being about righting old wrongs and became about something else entirely. I love spending time with you, Adelaide. I love talking to you, hearing your laugh, watching you work in the garden. I love the way you hum when you think no one is listening, and how you always save the crispiest piece of bacon for me because you know it is my favorite." He reached out and took her hand. "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you, and I cannot keep it to myself anymore." Adelaide felt tears spring to her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "I love you too, Quincy. I have for a while now, but I was afraid to say anything. I thought maybe you just saw me as someone you had rescued, someone you felt responsible for." "No, Adelaide. I see you as a strong, beautiful, amazing woman who I want to spend the rest of my life with if you will have me." His eyes were intense in the lamplight, full of hope and love. "Yes," she whispered, and "yes, I will have you." Quincy leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle brush of lips that sent warmth flooding through Adelaide's entire body. It was her first kiss, and it was perfect. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "I have been wanting to do that for months," Quincy admitted, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I wish you had done it sooner." Adelaide leaned into his touch, marveling at how right this felt. They talked long into the night, the storm forgotten as they shared their hopes and dreams for the future. Quincy wanted to expand the ranch, eventually hiring more hands and building it into something substantial. Adelaide wanted to turn the house into a real home, warm and welcoming. They talked about marriage, about children, about growing old together on this land they were building together. When Quincy finally left her room, Adelaide lay back on her pillows, hugging the extra quilt to her chest. She felt like she was floating, like her heart might burst from happiness. All the pain and fear of her past seemed distant now, overshadowed by the bright promise of her future with Quincy. The next morning, Tom took one look at their faces and grinned. "About time you two figured it out. I was starting to think I would have to knock your heads together." "You knew?" Adelaide asked, blushing. "Of course I knew. It has been obvious for months that you were both head over heels for each other. I am just glad you finally did something about it." Tom clapped Quincy on the shoulder. "Congratulations, my friend. You found yourself a good woman." "I know," Quincy said, pulling Adelaide close and kissing the top of her head. "I am the luckiest man in Montana." They were married in late March, as soon as the spring thaw made travel possible again. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church in the nearest town with Tom and a few neighbors as witnesses. Adelaide wore a dress she had made herself from soft blue fabric that brought out the color of her eyes. Quincy wore his best shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven. As they stood before the minister and exchanged vows, Adelaide felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was where she was meant to be, standing beside this man, promising to love him for the rest of her life. When Quincy slipped a simple gold band on her finger, she looked up at him and saw her own joy reflected in his eyes. "I love you, Adelaide Pearson," he whispered. "I love you too, Quincy Pearson," she whispered back. Their wedding night was spent in a hotel in town, a luxury they had saved up for. Quincy was gentle and patient, understanding that this was all new to Adelaide. He made her feel cherished and desired, and when she finally fell asleep in his arms, she knew that she had found where she truly belonged. Life on the ranch took on a new rhythm after their marriage. Adelaide threw herself into making their house a true home. She sewed curtains and cushions, planted flowers around the porch, and filled the rooms with warmth and love. Quincy worked tirelessly to build up their herd and improve their land. Tom remained with them, becoming more than just a hired hand, but a true friend and part of their family. By the time summer arrived, the ranch was thriving. They had a healthy herd of cattle, a productive garden, and several chickens providing fresh eggs. Adelaide had even convinced Quincy to let her get a milk cow, which she named Buttercup. Life was hard work, but it was good work, and Adelaide went to bed each night tired but content. In late August, Adelaide began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice, and she had been feeling queasy in the mornings. She waited another week to be sure before telling Quincy. And when she finally did, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. "A baby?" His face lit up with wonder. "Adelaide, we are going to have a baby?" "I think so. I am pretty sure." She laughed as he picked her up and spun her around, then quickly set her down, worried he might hurt her. "I am going to be a father." He said the words with such awe that Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. "And you are going to be a mother. Our baby is the luckiest child in the world." Tom was equally excited when they told him, immediately starting to plan how they would need to add another room onto the house for the nursery. The three of them spent many evenings discussing names and making plans for the new addition to their family. Adelaide's pregnancy progressed smoothly. Quincy was attentive and protective, constantly worrying that she was doing too much. Adelaide found his concern endearing, even if she sometimes had to remind him that she was pregnant, not fragile. As her belly grew she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She was bringing new life into this world, a child who would be loved and cherished, who would grow up safe and happy on this beautiful land. The baby came in early April, on a morning when the world was awakening from winter's grip. Adelaide's labor was long and difficult, but she was strong, and with Quincy holding her hand and encouraging her, she brought their son into the world. He was perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same blue-gray as his father's. "What should we name him?" Quincy asked, cradling the tiny bundle against his chest with a tenderness that made Adelaide's heart melt. "I was thinking James, after your uncle who left you this land. James Quincy Pearson." She reached out and stroked her son's soft cheek. "James, I like that. James Quincy Pearson, welcome to the world, little one. Your mother and I are going to make sure you have the best life possible." Quincy's voice was thick with emotion, and Adelaide saw tears in his eyes. The first few months with baby James were exhausting but wonderful. He was a good baby, generally happy and healthy, though he had a powerful set of lungs when he wanted something. Adelaide marveled at how much love she felt for this tiny person, how every smile and coo filled her with joy. Quincy was a devoted father, always eager to hold James or help with his care. Adelaide often found him in the nursery late at night, just watching their son sleep with a look of wonder on his face. The ranch continued to prosper, and they hired 2 additional ranch hands to help with the growing workload. When James was 6 months old, Adelaide realized she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy felt different, harder on her body. But she was determined to give James a sibling, and Quincy was there every step of the way, supporting her through the difficult moments. Their daughter was born in February during a gentle snowfall that blanketed the ranch in pristine white. She was smaller than James had been, more delicate, with a cap of light brown hair and her mother's features. They named her Sarah, and from the moment James saw her, he was smitten with his baby sister. Life on the Pearson Ranch became a beautiful chaos of children, animals, and hard work. Adelaide and Quincy fell into a partnership that worked seamlessly. They supported each other through the difficult times and celebrated together during the good times. Their love deepened and matured, becoming something steady and enduring. Years passed, marked by the changing of seasons and the growth of their children. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working alongside his father with the cattle. Sarah was more adventurous, always exploring and getting into mischief. When she was 4, Adelaide gave birth to another son, whom they named Daniel. He was the baby of the family, spoiled by his older siblings and doted on by everyone. Tom eventually met a widow in town and married her, moving to a small house they built on the far edge of the property. He remained Quincy's right hand, but now he had his own family to care for. Adelaide was thrilled to have another woman nearby, and she and Martha became close friends. As the children grew, Adelaide would sometimes tell them the story of how she and Quincy met. She told them about the boarding house in Ely, about the burned biscuits, and about how their father had said he liked them crispy anyway. She told them about the journey to Montana and the early days of building the ranch. But mostly she told them about how love could change everything, how one act of kindness could alter the course of a life. "So Daddy saved you?" Sarah asked one evening as Adelaide tucked her into bed. "In a way, yes, but I also think we saved each other. He needed someone to build a life with, and I needed someone to show me that I was worth more than I'd been told. We found each other at exactly the right time." Adelaide smoothed Sarah's hair back from her forehead. "I want to find a love like that someday," Sarah said sleepily. "You will, sweetheart. When the time is right, you will." Adelaide kissed her daughter's forehead and blew out the lamp. She found Quincy on the porch, as he often was in the evenings, looking out over their land. She settled into the chair beside him, and he immediately reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "Just how blessed I am, how different my life could have been if I had not walked into that boarding house in Ely on that particular day. If I had not seen you and felt compelled to help. He turned to look at her, and even after all these years, the love in his eyes still took her breath away. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Adelaide. And you are the best thing that ever happened to me. She leaned her head on his shoulder, content to sit in comfortable silence as the sun set over the mountains. The years continued to flow by. James grew into a strong young man who eventually took over much of the ranch operations, allowing Quincy to slow down a bit. He married a sweet girl from town, and they built a house on the property and started their own family. Sarah became a teacher, educating the children in the nearest town. She married a shopkeeper, and they split their time between town and the ranch. Daniel followed in Tom's footsteps, becoming the best ranch hand Quincy had ever employed, and showed no signs of wanting to leave the land he loved. Adelaide and Quincy grew old together, their hair graying and their faces lining with the marks of a life well lived. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. They still sat on the porch together most evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset. Quincy still kissed Adelaide every morning when they woke up and every night before they went to sleep. And Adelaide still made biscuits, though she never burned them anymore. But sometimes, just for fun, she would intentionally make them extra crispy on the bottom, and Quincy would eat them with a grin, remembering that day long ago when he had first truly seen the woman who would become his everything. One autumn day, when Adelaide was 63 and Quincy was 65, they rode out together to their favorite spot on the ranch. It was a hill that overlooked the entire property, where you could see the house, the barns, the cattle grazing, and in the distance, the mountains rising up against the sky. They dismounted and sat on a fallen log, enjoying the crisp air and the brilliant colors of the changing leaves. "Do you ever regret it?" Adelaide asked suddenly. "Taking a chance on a scared girl in a boarding house? Your life might have been simpler without me." Quincy looked at her in astonishment. "Regret it? Adelaide, you gave me everything. A home, a family, a purpose. You taught me what real love looks like, not the violent, toxic relationship my parents had, but something beautiful and healthy and strong." He took both of her hands in his. "Every good thing in my life came from the day I met you. I would not change a single moment." "Not even the burned biscuits?" Adelaide teased, her eyes sparkling. "Especially not the burned biscuits. Those biscuits brought us together." He laughed and pulled her close, kissing her with the same passion he had shown as a younger man. "I love you, Adelaide Pearson. I always have, and I always will." "I love you too, Quincy Pearson. Thank you for saving me." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for letting me," he murmured into her hair. They sat there for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky and remembering all the years they had shared. The struggles and the triumphs, the tears and the laughter, the ordinary days and the extraordinary moments. It had not always been easy, but it had always been worth it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Adelaide thought about how far she had come from that terrified girl in Ely. She had built a life beyond her wildest dreams, surrounded by love and family and purpose. And it all started with a kind cowboy who saw past her bruises and recognized the strong woman underneath. "Ready to head back?" Quincy asked, standing and offering her his hand. "Always," Adelaide replied, taking his hand and letting him help her up. "As long as I'm with you, I am ready for anything." They mounted their horses and rode back to the ranch as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Smoke rose from the chimney of their home, where their family was gathering for supper. Grandchildren would be running around excited to see them. James would be discussing ranch business with Daniel. Sarah would be setting the table with Martha's help. It was noisy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. As they entered the house, surrounded by the warmth and love of the family they had created together, Adelaide caught Quincy's eye across the room. He winked at her, and she felt the same flutter in her heart that she had felt the first time he smiled at her all those years ago. Some things, she thought, never changed, and thank goodness for that. The evening passed in a blur of good food and laughter. Their grandchildren clamored for stories, and Quincy obliged with tales of the old days when the ranch was just beginning and everything was an adventure. Adelaide watched her family with deep contentment, grateful for every single person in the room. Later, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Adelaide and Quincy stood alone in their kitchen. Adelaide was washing the last of the dishes when Quincy came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Do you remember the first time I helped you in a kitchen?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "How could I forget? You told Mrs. Hutchinson you had spilled the water when it was really me. You protected me even then." She turned in his arms to face him. "I knew from that moment that you were special. I just did not know how special you would become to me." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "You are my heart, Adelaide. Everything I am, everything I have, it is all because of you." "We built this life together," Adelaide said softly. "Every beam of this house, every fence on this land, every child and grandchild, we did it together." "Together," Quincy agreed. "That is the best word I know. Together." They stood there in the quiet kitchen, holding each other as they had done countless times over the decades. Outside, the Montana night was vast and starry. Inside, their home was warm and filled with memories. And between them, the love that had started with burned biscuits and a kind word had grown into something eternal, something that would last beyond their years and live on in the family they had created. As they finally headed to bed, Adelaide looked back at the kitchen one more time. Tomorrow she would make biscuits for breakfast, and maybe, just maybe, she would burn the bottoms a little bit just to remind them both of how far they had come and how precious every moment together truly was. Because in the end, it was not the perfect biscuits that mattered. It was the man who loved her enough to eat the burned ones and make her smile in her darkest moment. That was the real gift, the real miracle. And Adelaide Pearson knew she would be grateful for it every single day for the rest of her life. The autumn turned to winter, and then winter gave way to spring once more. Adelaide and Quincy continued their quiet life on the ranch, supported by their children and surrounded by grandchildren who adored them. They had lived through difficult times and prosperous times, through heartache and joy, and through it all, their love had remained constant. On a warm spring morning, Adelaide stood in her kitchen making biscuits, just as she had done thousands of times before. But today her hands were steadier, her heart was fuller, and her smile was brighter than ever. Because she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she was exactly where she belonged. She was home, in every sense of the word, and the man she loved was just outside, working the land they had built together. When she called him in for breakfast, Quincy came immediately, his face lighting up at the sight of her. He kissed her cheek and sat down at the table, accepting the plate she handed him with a grateful smile. "Perfect as always, he said after taking a bite of biscuit. "Maybe I should burn them next time for old time's sake," Adelaide teased. "Crispy or not, I would eat anything you made," Quincy replied, reaching across the table to take her hand, "because it is made with love, and that makes everything taste better." Adelaide squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar calluses from years of hard work, and knew that she would never take this life for granted. She had come from nothing, from abuse and fear and hopelessness, and through the kindness of one good man she had found everything: a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that would endure until the end of time. As they sat together in their kitchen, eating breakfast and planning their day, Adelaide sent up a silent prayer of thanks. Thanks for the burned biscuits that had brought Quincy into her life. Thanks for his courage in offering her a way out. Thanks for every moment they had shared since that day in Ely, Nevada, when a frightened girl met a kind cowboy and both of their lives changed forever. The sun streamed through the windows, casting everything in a golden glow. Outside, the ranch was waking up, cattle lowing in the distance, birds singing in the trees, and inside two people who had found each other against all odds sat together, their love as strong and steady as the mountains that surrounded their home. It was, Adelaide thought, the perfect ending to a story that had started with fear and pain but had transformed into something beautiful. And though she knew that someday their story would end, she also knew that the love they had built would continue on in their children and grandchildren, a legacy of kindness, courage, and unwavering devotion. For now, though, there was this moment, this perfect, ordinary, extraordinary moment of sitting with the man she loved, eating breakfast in the home they had made, and knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Just as they always had, just as they always would. And that, Adelaide Pearson decided, was the very definition of a happy ending.